Hey everyone, I'm Scott Krebs. Today we're going to continue our series, What Would Jesus Say to Your Church? We're looking at the 7 letters that Jesus wrote in the book of Revelation. In this video, we're going to look at the 3rd letter, so let's jump right into it. The 3rd letter in Revelation is written to the church in Pergamum. Now, this letter is found in chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And Pergamum is an important city, like the other cities we've looked at. It's an important city. It was a religious center in Asia, in that part of the Roman Empire. And it was an important city because it had all kinds of temples to Zeus and a lot of other gods. And it also was a center for the Roman imperial cult. This is the official worship of the Roman emperor. And so a lot of that was going on in the city. And it was especially the cult to the Roman emperor that caused problems for Christians, because Christians were persecuted because of this imperial cult, because Christians wouldn't worship the emperor. And in fact, one Christian had already been killed for his faith, as Jesus says in this letter. But in this letter to this persecuted church, we find some important challenge for us as Christians. So let's take a look. The letter tells us that Jesus is the true judge. In the city of Pergamum, everyone would have known that Caesar's in charge because people worshiped him. Even if you really didn't believe that Caesar was God, you pretended like you did because he was in charge. And so when Jesus writes this letter to this church, he shows himself as the true judge, the true one in charge. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum, write, the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. Jesus is pictured with a huge double-edged sword, and Jesus shows up in this letter as a warrior, as a fighter. He is going to take care of his church. He's the one in charge. It's not Caesar. It's not the Roman governor. He's the one who's in charge. He's the one who sees that his people are suffering, and he'll one day come to judge those who persecute them. But we also see in this letter that Jesus is the judge because this church has a problem, the problem of false teaching, and Jesus has come to judge the false teachers in this church, and that's where the problem in this church really resides. And so in this letter, we learn that false teaching corrodes the church. Although Jesus knows the suffering of this church and he loves them for withstanding the suffering, he's got a problem, and the problem are false teachers. Now, the false teachers hadn't influenced everyone in the church, but they had brought this toxic, harmful element into the church. Take a look. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel so that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us exactly what these false teachers were teaching, but he connects them to 2 different groups. First, he connects them to the teaching of Balaam. Now, Balaam shows up in the book of Numbers, and he was a false prophet that was tried to use by a king to bring down the Israelites in the Old Testament. Balaam was supposed to speak a curse against Israel in the Old Testament, but he couldn't do it. He was blocked from that. And so what Balaam ended up doing was he got Israel to disobey God by changing their practices, by getting them to compromise with God's truth. As it says there in this passage, that Balaam, the teachings of Balaam led them to eating food sacrificed to idols, which was condemned in the Old Testament law, and participating in sexual immorality. And then Jesus also talks about this other group who's having influence that he calls the Nicolaitans. Now, they've also come up in the first letter, the letter to Ephesus, and the Nicolaitans is a group of false teachers that were influencing, it seems like, all these churches in Revelation. And again, we don't know exactly what they were teaching, but it appears to be the similar kind of thing, that they were getting Christians to make compromises with the truth of God. So Christians were eating meat sacrificed to idols. And what this kind of envisions is that Christians would go to parties where people would come together. It was like kind of a neighborhood block party. They would all get together. They would bring their food before a god or a statue. They'd dedicate it to the statue, and then they'd eat it. Well, that's kind of like taking part in pagan worship, and Christians were doing that, and that dishonored God. And then, of course, sexual immorality, which would have been really prominent in the Roman culture, all sorts of sexual immorality that went with temple worship and stuff like that. And so you can think of sexual immorality as sort of being just kind of like a metaphor for being impure before God, but also as these Christians were probably actually practicing sexual immorality. And so Jesus says, look, if you don't deal with this compromise of the truth, I'm going to come and I'm going to judge you. But Jesus says, look, this doesn't have to end badly. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. Jesus says, look, if you overcome, as he says in every letter, look, if you overcome this, whatever your hang up is, Jesus says, I have so many blessings for you. Jesus says, I'll give you the hidden manna. And then you might remember the manna in the Old Testament, and Moses and the Israelites, when they wandered through the wilderness, they ate manna from God every day. And the Bible is saying that this hidden manna, it's like the eternal sustenance that God gives us to sustain us in this life and in the life to come. And then he talks about a white stone, and white stones were used in a few different ways. If you wanted to go to a really cool party, like a really cool celebration, you'd often bring a white stone, and that was kind of like your entrance, like you were allowed to come into the party. Or sometimes in the Roman court system, jurors, when they were acquitting someone of guilt, when they were saying this person is not guilty, they'd put a white stone out to say this person's not guilty. And so probably both these images are being used, that Jesus will give us a white stone that shows we're not guilty, we're pure before God, because we're covered in the blood of the Lamb, and we get entrance into God's great banquet, his great celebration. So that's this letter. Now, what does this letter mean for us today? Christians must resist the temptation to compromise. The problem in this letter is like the opposite of the Ephesian letter. Remember, the Ephesians, they lived out the truth, but they lacked love. Well, love isn't apparently a problem for the church in Pergamum. Really, their problem is they're not really holding to the truth, and they're compromising the truth. And that's a good message for you and I today, because today Christians constantly compromise the truth. We get involved in similar stuff. We get involved in sexual immorality, recreational drug use. We just kind of don't have a biblical worldview like all of our friends around us. We sort of live like we don't have a biblical worldview. And when you do that, you're making compromises with the truth of God. Instead of worshiping Jesus as the Savior and the judge and the one who's in control, you're worshiping sex or money or yourself. You're making an idol out of these things. And Jesus comes along and he says, no, here's the truth. The truth is that I love you, that I saved you, that I rescued you, that I'm coming back for you, and that I'm the one in charge. And so as Christians, we need to ask ourselves, am I making compromises? Am I living out the truth, or am I compromising God's truth? Am I living in a way that just sort of makes me fit in with society around me, or am I living in a way that truly honors God no matter what happens, even if that causes difficulty in my life? And that's the letter to Pergamum. Well, thanks so much for watching this video. It's the third installment in our series, Letters to the Seven Churches. What would Jesus say to your church? So we'll have 4 more letters coming our way shortly. Please check out our other videos. We have a lot of other resources on Bible topics, faith and life topics, all kinds of different stuff. I've got some videos with my kids. And if this is your first time at our channel, thanks for checking us out. Please subscribe. And if you have other ways to apply any of these messages, put those in the comments below. Thanks a lot.